You picked the wrong county to be difficult." The words came from a man whose hand had already moved to his belt before his boots stopped crunching on the gravel. Afternoon sun glinted off mirrored sunglasses, off the badge pinned to a chest puffed with the particular arrogance of someone who had never once faced consequences for the tone he was about to take. Pump 4 of the quick fuel station hummed its mechanical song while the woman standing beside it did not flinch, did not step back, did not give him the satisfaction of fear he clearly expected to see. Her credit card was still in her hand. The chip reader had rejected it 3 times. And now, 2 Jessup County Sheriff's deputies were walking toward her like she had committed a crime more serious than existing, while black at a gas station 40 minutes from Fort Stewart on an August afternoon hot enough to make the asphalt shimmer. Inside the convenience store, behind glass smudged with handprints and the residue of summer humidity, a woman with rhinestone-studded reading glasses was already on the phone. Her voice carried through the propped-open door, high and performative, the practiced cadence of someone who had called 911 before and knew exactly how to make suspicion sound like civic duty. The recording would later become evidence. Right now, it was just fear dressed up as concern, traveling through cellular towers to a dispatcher who had heard this kind of call 100 times before. "Yes, I need to report suspicious activity. There's a black woman at my gas station, the Quick Fuel on Route 17. She's been standing at the pump for almost 10 minutes just staring at the machine. I don't know what she's planning, but something isn't right about her." The dispatcher's response was professional, neutral. "Is she causing a disturbance, ma'am?" "Not yet, but she's got this look about her. Aggressive, wearing some kind of military-style jacket. She won't make eye contact, just keeps staring at those pumps like she's casing the place." "Has she made any threats? Damaged any property?" "No, but I'm telling you, something's not right. She doesn't belong here. Can you send someone?" The call ended. The woman at Pump 4 knew none of this. She was focused on the chip reader, trying a second card, wondering if the machine was malfunctioning or if small-town Georgia simply had opinions about which credit cards deserved to work. She checked her watch automatically, a habit so ingrained she did it without thinking. 14:47. The time filed itself away in a corner of her mind, trained to catalog details that might matter later. The crunch of gravel grew closer. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she slid her card back into her wallet, placed her wallet in her back pocket, and only then pivoted to face the 2 deputies now standing 6 feet away. Her hands remained at her sides, palms slightly forward, fingers relaxed, a posture that communicated compliance without submission, the kind of stance learned in places where the wrong gesture could escalate into violence. The first deputy was young, late 20s, with the gym-built frame of someone who treated physical dominance as a substitute for professional competence. His name tag read Bassett, badge number 4471. She noted it automatically, the way she noted the position of his partner, the angle of the afternoon sun, the location of the single security camera pointed at the register rather than the pumps. His partner was a woman, mid-30s, clipboard, already in hand. Kincaid, badge 4892. She hung back 2 paces, positioning herself for documentation rather than confrontation. The configuration was familiar, one to intimidate, one to record, a choreography perfected through repetition. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." The command came from Bassett, voice pitched low with manufactured authority. He had not introduced himself, had not stated the reason for approach, had already decided who she was and what she deserved based on the color of her skin and the nervous phone call from a woman who confused presence with threat. Vivian Cole did not step away from her vehicle. She did not step toward the deputies either. She remained exactly where she was, weight balanced, breathing steady, every muscle in her body controlled by discipline that had been forged over 31 years in institutions these men could not imagine. "Good afternoon, officers. Is there a problem?" The question was neutral, cooperative, precisely calibrated to give no excuse for escalation. But she saw it land wrong anyway. Saw Bassett's jaw tighten at the fact that she had responded with a question instead of immediate compliance. Saw Kincaid make a note on her clipboard before the interaction had even properly begun. "We received a report of suspicious activity." Kincaid's voice was clipped, efficient. "We're going to need to see some identification." Vivian's hands remained visible. She announced her movement before making it, the way she had trained countless others to do. "My wallet is in my right rear pocket. I'm going to reach for it now." Slowly. She retrieved the wallet, extracted her Georgia driver's license, and held it out. Kincaid took it, examined it with the skeptical squint of someone looking for reasons to doubt what she was seeing. "This says Atlanta. You're a long way from home." "I'm visiting family in Savannah. Stopped for gas. Is there a law against that?" The question hung in the hot August air. Somewhere in the distance, a truck downshifted on the highway. The pump beside her clicked off, having finally accepted payment from a card that worked. But nobody moved to acknowledge it. Bassett stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, see the sweat beading at his temples despite the mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes. His hand had not left his belt since he exited the patrol car. A message, a threat wrapped in body language designed to make civilians feel small. "Watch your tone." The words were soft, almost conversational, and absolutely loaded with menace. Vivian Cole did not watch her tone. She did not adjust her posture, lower her eyes, or perform the deference that might make this easier. She had spent too many years earning the right to stand exactly as she was standing to surrender it now to a deputy whose idea of law enforcement began and ended with intimidation. She looked at Bassett's badge number again, committed it to memory. Then she looked past him toward the convenience store where Marlene Shipley stood watching through the window, phone still in hand, satisfaction already spreading across her face. The chip reader beeped its acceptance of her card, and behind her, a patrol car door opened. 12 hours earlier, Vivian Cole had woken in a Hampton Inn off Interstate 95 to the sound of her phone buzzing against the nightstand. The text was from her daughter, Nina, and it contained the gentle scolding that had become their tradition whenever Vivian traveled without escort. "Mom, just take the interstate. Stop trying to find authentic diners in random counties." She smiled at the screen, typed back that she would be in Savannah by dinner, and set the phone aside. The room was still dark, dawn light barely beginning to seep through the gap in the blackout curtains. She had slept 5 hours. More than usual. The civilian world had different rhythms than the ones that had governed her life for 3 decades, and she was still learning to let her body rest when rest was available. She rose and made the bed before her feet had fully registered the carpet beneath them. Military corners, sheets tucked tight enough to bounce a quarter. A habit so deeply embedded it would probably outlive her. The housekeeping staff would remake it anyway, but that was not the point. The point was discipline. The point was that standards did not relax simply because no one was watching. Her toiletries were arranged in precise rows on the bathroom counter. Toothbrush at the left edge, toothpaste beside it, moisturizer and sunscreen in order of application. She had unpacked them this way the night before, just as she had unpacked them in hotel rooms across 4 continents over 31 years of service. The routine was armor, a way of making unfamiliar spaces feel controlled. She showered quickly, dressed in clothes she had laid out before sleeping. Jeans, comfortable for driving. A worn Howard University sweatshirt from her undergraduate days, soft from decades of washing. Plain white sneakers. No jewelry except her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had survived 3 deployments and 1 marriage that had not. She wore it still because it had belonged to her mother before her, because it reminded her of where she came from, because some things did not need explanation to matter. The mirror showed her a woman in her early 50s, gray threading through close-cropped hair, lines at the corners of eyes that had seen more than most people could imagine. She looked, she thought, like exactly what she was dressed to be. A middle-aged black woman traveling alone, unremarkable, anonymous, exactly the way she wanted it. She packed her suitcase using a compression method that maximized space and minimized wrinkles. Each item rolled rather than folded, placed in a sequence she could repeat blindfolded. The technique was military issue, taught in basic training and refined over years of deployments where packing efficiency could mean the difference between making a helicopter and missing one. She did not think about this as she packed. It was simply how she packed. The way other people might tie their shoes or brush their teeth. Downstairs, the breakfast area was half full with travelers in various stages of wakefulness. She poured coffee from the carafe, selected a yogurt and a banana from the continental spread, and found a table by the window where she could watch the parking lot while she ate. A white woman at the waffle station caught her eye. Mid-40s, blonde highlights, athleisure wear that probably cost more than Vivian's entire outfit. The woman watched Vivian pour her coffee, then clutched her purse tighter against her body and angled away. A small gesture. A familiar one. The universal semaphore of white discomfort, performed without conscious thought, by people who would insist they did not have a racist bone in their bodies. Vivian noticed it the way she noticed everything, filed it away, did not react. She had learned decades ago that some battles were not worth fighting, that some ignorance could not be educated away in the time it took to eat breakfast, that preserving energy for the fights that mattered required letting smaller indignities pass without comment. She ate alone, scrolling through emails on her phone. Nothing urgent. She was technically on leave for the first time in 8 months, and her staff knew better than to disturb her with anything that could wait. The messages could sit until she reached Savannah, until she had hugged her daughter for the first time in 4 months, until she had eaten dinner that someone else had cooked in a house that smelled like the home Nina was building 3,000 miles from where Vivian worked. By 8:30, she was on the road. She had planned the route carefully, choosing 2-lane highways over the interstate despite Nina's protests. The scenic route added 90 minutes to the drive, but subtracted the probability of being recognized. Major highways meant rest stops full of military families. It meant convoys of soldiers heading to or from Fort Stewart. It meant the possibility of running into someone who knew her face, her rank, her reputation. And what she wanted from this drive was anonymity. A few hours of being nobody special. A few hours of existing outside the weight of responsibility that had defined her entire adult life. The Georgia countryside unfolded in shades of green and gold, late summer fields stretching toward tree lines that shimmered in the heat. She passed through small towns with names that sounded like they belonged in country songs. Stopped once for gas at a station where no one looked twice at her, where the transaction was nothing more than card accepted, tank filled, road resumed. At noon, she pulled off at a roadside barbecue stand with hand-painted signs promising the best ribs in Burke County. The owner was an elderly black man with white hair and a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He served her a plate of pulled pork with extra cornbread, then refused to let her pay for the sweet tea because, he said, it was too hot a day to drink anything else. "You take care on those back roads," he told her as she was leaving. "Some of these counties got memories longer than their patience." She thanked him for the meal, for the warning, for the moment of warmth in a journey that required her to be invisible. Then she drove on, the taste of good barbecue lingering, the old man's words settling somewhere in the back of her mind, where instinct lived. At 2:15, she passed a sign welcoming her to Jessup County. Population 8,400. The slogan painted beneath the numbers read, "Where neighbors still wave." She did not wave back. 20 minutes later, she pulled into the quick fuel station on Route 17 because her gas gauge was hovering near empty and the next station was 30 miles ahead. The lot was mostly deserted. A few pickup trucks clustered near the entrance. A faded awning that had once been blue, now bleached by decades of Georgia sun. Pumps that looked like they had not been updated since the Clinton administration. She pulled up to pump 4, killed the engine, and stepped out into heat that hit like a wall. The asphalt was soft under her sneakers, radiating warmth even in the shade of the awning. She inserted her credit card, selected regular, and waited for the authorization. The machine beeped its rejection. "Card not accepted. Please try again." She tried again. Same result. Tried a different card. Same rejection. The chip reader was either malfunctioning or programmed to be selective about which cards it liked, and she had encountered enough of both to know the distinction rarely mattered. Inside the convenience store, through glass that needed cleaning, a woman with frosted hair and rhinestone glasses was watching her with the particular intensity of someone who had already decided what she was seeing. The woman's name was Marlene Shipley. She had owned this gas station for 32 years. She had seen trouble come through before, and she knew exactly what it looked like. It looked like a black woman in a Howard University sweatshirt, standing alone at a pump, apparently having difficulty with the card reader. It looked like someone who did not belong, someone who needed to be reported, someone whose presence in her space was sufficient cause for concern. Marlene reached for her phone. The 911 call lasted 2 minutes and 14 seconds. By the time it ended, deputies were already en route. Not because the call warranted urgent response, but because Unit 47 was already positioned within 400 meters of the quick fuel, had been idling there for reasons the dispatch log would never adequately explain. Vivian Cole did not know any of this. She was focused on the chip reader, on the card in her hand, on the minor frustration of technology that refused to cooperate. She checked her watch. 14:47. Made a mental note that she might need to call her bank about potential fraud alerts. Reminded herself to fill up in Savannah instead if this machine would not cooperate. Then gravel crunched behind her. A patrol car rolled into the lot, light bar dark, but engine running. And the day she had planned, the anonymous drive to her daughter's house, the simple pleasure of being nobody for a few hours, began to unravel in ways she could not yet imagine. If this story already has your attention, hit that subscribe button now. Because what happens next is the kind of confrontation that changes everything. Chapter. The patrol car doors opened in sequence, front passenger first, then driver. 2 deputies emerged with the synchronized movements of partners who had performed this approach dozens of times before. Their footsteps on gravel created a rhythm that Vivian had heard in other contexts, in other countries, in situations where the wrong response could mean the difference between walking away and being carried. She turned slowly, kept her hands visible, noted the badge numbers, the body positions, the absence of name introductions, or stated reasons for approach. Noted also the slight relaxation in Bassett's shoulders when she turned to face him, the way his posture shifted from ready to dominant once he had confirmed her compliance with the unspoken command to acknowledge his presence. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." She did not step away. The instruction had no legal basis. She was not under arrest, not suspected of a specific crime, not interfering with any legitimate law enforcement activity. Standing beside her own car at a gas pump was not a crime, and moving away from it simply because a deputy told her to would establish a dynamic of submission she had no intention of accepting. "Good afternoon, officers. Is there a problem?" The words were carefully chosen, polite but not deferential, a question rather than compliance. The kind of response that placed the burden on them to articulate a reason for the encounter, rather than assuming she would simply accept their authority without question. Bassett's jaw tightened. Behind the mirrored sunglasses, she could imagine his eyes narrowing. He was not accustomed to questions, not from people who looked like her, not in a county where the badge meant compliance and questions meant trouble. "We received a report of suspicious activity." Kincaid stepped forward with her clipboard, positioning herself as the procedural element of this encounter. "We're going to need to see some identification." Vivian did not ask what suspicious activity had been reported, did not point out that standing at a gas pump was not, by any legal definition, suspicious. She announced her movement, reached for her wallet, and produced her Georgia driver's license. The interaction was being recorded, she assumed, by at least one body cam. She would give them no excuse to claim she had been uncooperative. Kincaid examined the license with the slow deliberation of someone looking for problems. Her eyes moved from the photo to Vivian's face and back again, as if verifying that the black woman in front of her was indeed the same black woman on the card. "This says Atlanta. You're a long way from home." The observation was not a question. It was an accusation formatted as small talk, designed to put her on the defensive, to make her explain her presence in a place where her presence was apparently considered anomalous. I'm visiting family in Savannah. Stopped for gas. Is there a law against that? She heard the words leave her mouth and recognized them as the kind of response that would be labeled attitude in the report these deputies would file later. The kind of response that transformed a routine encounter into something adversarial in the minds of officers who expected deference and received precision instead. Bassett stepped closer. His shadow fell across her, blocking the afternoon sun, creating a zone of artificial darkness between them. The move was deliberate, intimidation dressed as conversation, the kind of physical encroachment designed to make civilians feel small, to remind them who held power in this exchange. Watch your tone. The words were quiet, almost soft, and loaded with the particular menace of someone who had used that phrase before, who had watched it land on people with less composure, who had learned that tone could be used as justification for escalation when actual misconduct was absent. Vivian did not watch her tone. She maintained it. Level, clear, professional. The tone of someone who had briefed generals and testified before Congress and delivered news that changed the course of operations to rooms full of people whose rank exceeded her own. The tone of someone who did not yield because a deputy with a chip on his shoulder told her to. I'm happy to cooperate with any lawful procedure, Deputy. Could you tell me what specific conduct prompted this stop? The word landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Procedure. It was a word that belonged in official contexts, in training manuals, in the mouths of people who knew how systems worked and how to hold them accountable. Coming from a black woman at a gas pump in rural Georgia, it sounded like challenge, like threat, like exactly the kind of trouble Bassett had been trained to identify and suppress. Kincaid's pen had stopped moving on her clipboard. Her eyes flicked to Bassett, then back to Vivian. Something had shifted in the encounter. The script these deputies had expected to follow, the one where they asked questions and the civilian answered them meekly, was not being followed. And people who deviated from scripts made cops nervous. The gas station door opened. Marlene Shipley emerged into the afternoon heat, phone still clutched in one hand, righteousness animating every step. She had been watching through the window, had seen the deputies arrive, had decided that her presence was required to ensure the situation was handled properly. That's her. Marlene's voice carried across the lot with the confidence of someone who believed herself to be helping. That's the one I called about. She's been casing the place for who knows how long. I've seen her type before. They come through, scope out what's worth taking, then come back at night. Vivian turned to face the woman who had decided her existence was cause for police intervention. Marlene was perhaps 60, with the frosted hair and tanning bed complexion of someone who spent money maintaining an appearance of youth. Her rhinestone glasses caught the light as she approached, sparkling with an absurdity that would have been comic under different circumstances. Ma'am, I stopped to buy gas. The card reader wasn't working. That's the entirety of my suspicious activity. Marlene's face contorted with offense. The reasonable explanation was not what she wanted. She wanted confirmation of her suspicions, validation of the phone call, the satisfaction of having been right to see danger in a stranger's presence. Don't you talk back to me. The words came fast, sharp with the particular entitlement of someone who had never been told her fear was not other people's problem. I've lived in this county my whole life. I know trouble when I see it. And what does trouble look like exactly? The question was quiet, dangerous. Vivian knew she should not ask it, knew that nothing good would come from forcing this woman to articulate the prejudice that animated her concern. But 31 years of navigating white spaces, of performing acceptability, of making herself smaller so others could feel comfortable, had accumulated into a weariness that no longer permitted strategic silence. Marlene sputtered. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. The question had exposed something she did not want to examine, something she would insist did not exist if pressed, something that nevertheless had prompted her to dial 911 about a woman whose only crime was struggling with a card reader. Bassett stepped between them, physically inserting himself into the confrontation. His hand remained on his belt. His posture had shifted from dominance to readiness, muscles tensed for action that had not yet become necessary. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down. He was speaking to Vivian, not to Marlene. Of course he was. The black woman asking uncomfortable questions was the one who needed to calm down, not the white woman who had called police on a stranger for the crime of existence. The hierarchy of whose emotions mattered was clear, and it aligned exactly with the hierarchy of whose bodies were considered threatening. Vivian took a breath, held it, released it slowly. The calming technique was one she taught to soldiers facing hostile interrogation, and using it now felt absurd, felt insulting, felt necessary. Because the encounter was escalating in ways that had nothing to do with her behavior and everything to do with the assumptions these people had brought with them. I am calm, Deputy. I've been calm throughout this encounter. I've answered your questions, provided identification, and cooperated with every lawful request. What I have not done is consent to being treated as a criminal when I have committed no crime. Kincaid's radio crackled. The license check had come back clean. No warrants, no flags, no criminal history. The professional response would have been to return the identification and apologize for the inconvenience. The professional response would have been to recognize that the 911 call had been unfounded and the encounter should end. Instead, Kincaid looked at her clipboard, then at Bassett, then at Vivian with an expression that suggested the absence of criminal history was somehow suspicious in itself. Ma'am, your registration shows this vehicle is registered to a V. Cole in Atlanta. That you? Yes, Vivian Cole, as my license indicates. And what do you do in Atlanta, Ms. Cole? The question had no legitimate investigative purpose. Her occupation was not relevant to a suspicious person call. But Kincaid was fishing now, looking for something, anything, that might justify the continued detention. Looking for a story that would make sense of the fact that a black woman had not wilted under their scrutiny. I work for the federal government. It was true. It was deliberately vague. It was exactly the kind of answer that would frustrate officers who wanted specifics they could use and prompt them to push harder. Bassett leaned in. What kind of federal work? The kind covered by privacy laws, Deputy. Is there anything else I can help you with, or am I free to go? The question was the correct one to ask. Am I being detained, or am I free to go? The binary that forced officers to either articulate reasonable suspicion for continued detention or release the person they had stopped. Vivian had used the phrasing many times, usually from the other side of the equation, usually when training subordinates about the legal limits of their authority. Bassett did not like the question. His posture shifted again, weight moving forward onto the balls of his feet, chin lifting with the particular arrogance of someone about to make a decision he would later regret. You're not going anywhere until we figure out what's going on here. And what, specifically, is going on here? That's what we're trying to determine. Based on what reasonable suspicion of criminal activity? The words hung in the air. Bassett's face had gone red beneath his tan. He was not accustomed to being questioned, not accustomed to civilians who knew the legal terminology, who could articulate the standards that governed police behavior, who refused to accept authority without basis. Marlene had retreated to the edge of the lot, still watching, phone now recording video. A teenager had emerged from the convenience store, his own phone raised. The encounter was being documented from multiple angles, which should have encouraged restraint, but might instead accelerate confrontation. Officers who felt observed sometimes calmed down. Officers who felt their authority was being challenged sometimes did the opposite. Kincaid stepped forward, clipboard extended like a shield. Ma'am, we're going to need you to consent to a search of your vehicle. The demand was a significant escalation. A search required either consent, probable cause, or a warrant. They had none of these. But Kincaid delivered the request as though it were routine, as though compliance were assumed, as though the constitutional protections against unreasonable search somehow did not apply to black women at gas stations in rural Georgia. I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. The refusal was firm, clear, on record. Vivian knew what would come next. Had seen it play out dozens of times in training scenarios, in after-action reports, in the careers of officers who mistook the desire to search for the authority to search. Kincaid's expression flickered. She had expected consent. Most people, when asked by police to permit a search, simply agreed. The pressure of the situation, the desire to prove they had nothing to hide, the assumption that refusal would make things worse, all combined to produce cooperation that was technically voluntary, but practically coerced. Refusal disrupted the script. Refusal to consent gives us probable cause to search under Georgia Code 17-521. The citation was delivered with confidence, with the authority of someone who had used it before and never been challenged. It was also completely wrong. Georgia Code 17-521 governed search incident to arrest. Vivian had not been arrested, and even if she had been, the Supreme Court in Schneckloth v. Bustamante had established decades ago that refusal to consent could not, by itself, constitute probable cause for search. Vivian reached slowly for her phone. Announced the movement before making it. "I'm going to take out my phone to document this interaction. Is that acceptable?" Bassett's hand moved to his weapon. Not drawing it, just touching it. A reminder of what he could do if she made the wrong move. "Go ahead, but one wrong move and we're going to have a problem." She extracted the phone from her back pocket with exaggerated care. Opened an app with 3 taps of her thumb. The sequence was practiced, automatic, a shortcut she had configured for exactly this kind of situation. "I'm documenting this interaction for my records. The time is now 14:53. Deputy Kincaid, badge 4892, has requested consent to search my vehicle. I have declined. She has cited Georgia Code 17-521 as grounds for probable cause." She paused, let the recording capture the silence, then continued. "For the record, Georgia Code 17-521 governs search incident to arrest, not consent refusals. I have not been arrested. The citation is inapplicable. Additionally, Schneckloth v. Bustamante, 1973, establishes that refusal to consent cannot constitute probable cause for search. The request for search lacks legal foundation." Kincaid's face went pale beneath her uniform hat. Bassett's hand tightened on his weapon. Behind them, the teenager with the phone had moved closer, capturing footage that would later appear on social media with millions of views. "Give me that phone." Bassett's voice had dropped, gone cold with the particular menace of someone whose authority had been publicly undermined. "Am I under arrest?" "You will be if you don't cooperate." "Cooperation and surrender of constitutional rights are not synonymous, Deputy." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Marlene had stopped talking, sensing that the encounter had crossed into territory she had not anticipated when she made her call. Gravel crunched. Another patrol car was pulling into the lot, the cavalry arriving to reinforce officers who had clearly lost control of a situation that should never have escalated in the first place. The driver's door opened. A man emerged, older than Bassett and Kincaid, silver at his temples, sergeant stripes on his sleeve. He surveyed the scene with the weary expression of someone who had been called to clean up messes before and expected to do so again. Sergeant Dean Hargrove had been with Jessup County Sheriff's Office for 22 years. He had learned to manage problems by making them bigger until they became someone else's jurisdiction. He had learned that paperwork was armor, that charges could be manufactured from thin air, that the system protected those who understood how to use it. He walked toward the confrontation with the unhurried pace of someone who believed himself to be in complete control. "What do we have here?" Kincaid briefed him in fragments. Suspicious individual. Refused consent to search. Possible obstruction. The narrative had evolved since the encounter began, each refusal reframed as resistance, each assertion of rights transformed into evidence of guilt. Hargrove listened with his arms crossed, eyes moving from Kincaid to Vivian and back again. He was sizing her up, looking for weaknesses, trying to determine what kind of problem she represented and how to make that problem go away. "Ma'am, this would go a lot easier if you just let us take a look. Innocent people don't have anything to hide." The statement was a classic. Vivian had heard it in every training module on coercive interrogation techniques, always presented as an example of what not to say, always accompanied by explanations of why the logic was fundamentally flawed. Innocent people had plenty to hide. Privacy was not evidence of guilt. The Fourth Amendment existed precisely because the founders understood that government power required limits. Innocent people also have Fourth Amendment rights, Sergeant. Hargrove's expression did not change. He had been challenged before. Had faced citizens who knew the law, who quoted amendments, who thought constitutional protections meant anything in counties where he decided what constituted compliance. You a lawyer? I'm a citizen who reads. He almost smiled. Almost. The corners of his mouth twitched with something that might have been amusement if it had not been preceded by contempt. One of those. The phrase was dismissive, reductive, a way of categorizing her as a type rather than engaging with her as an individual. She was one of those. The troublemakers. The people who thought they knew better than the officers trying to keep their community safe. The people who did not understand that cooperation was the only smart choice. Hargrove conferred with his deputies in low voices, heads bent together in the particular posture of people who did not want to be overheard. Vivian caught fragments. Loitering statute, county ordinance, failure to comply. They were building a case from nothing, manufacturing justification for an encounter that should have ended 5 minutes ago. Ma'am, you're in violation of Jessup County Ordinance 1422, loitering on commercial property with intent to cause public alarm. The ordinance was real. Vivian knew because she had studied Georgia law before accepting her current assignment, knew because understanding local legal landscapes was part of her job, knew because preparation was the habit of a lifetime. What Hargrove apparently did not know or did not care about was that the ordinance had been struck down twice by state courts and remained on the books only because no one had bothered to formally remove it. That ordinance was ruled unconstitutional in Henderson v. Jessup County, 2019. It's unenforceable. Hargrove's expression flickered. He had not expected her to know the case. Had assumed the citation would land with the weight of authority, would provide the cover he needed to justify whatever came next. But she had countered with precedent, had demonstrated that she understood not just her rights, but the specific legal history of this specific jurisdiction. You seem to know an awful lot about our county's laws. I know an awful lot about constitutional law, Sergeant. It tends to apply everywhere. The standoff had reached a tipping point. The deputies had run out of legitimate authority, but not out of options. They could manufacture charges, could escalate to arrest on grounds that would not survive judicial review, but would nevertheless achieve the immediate goal of asserting dominance, of teaching this woman what happened to people who talked back in Jessup County. Hargrove nodded to Bassett. The deputy produced handcuffs from his belt, metal glinting in the afternoon light. Turn around. Hands behind your back. On what charge? I said turn around. Vivian did not turn around. She remained facing the sergeant, her posture unchanged, her breathing controlled. Her hands were visible at her sides. She had made no threatening movements, had given no resistance, had done nothing that could justify physical restraint under any reasonable interpretation of law enforcement protocol. I am asking what charge justifies this arrest. Under Georgia Code 17-4-3, I have a right to know. Hargrove stepped closer, close enough that she could see the pores in his skin, the slight tremor of anger at the corner of his mouth. Disorderly conduct, obstruction of a peace officer, and whatever else we find when we search that vehicle. The threat was explicit now. The search they had no legal authority to conduct would happen anyway, and whatever they found, or claimed to find, would become the basis for additional charges. The entire encounter had been a fishing expedition, a pretext for asserting control over a woman who had committed no crime except refusing to be controlled. Bassett moved behind her. She felt his presence before he touched her, the displacement of air, the shadow falling across her shoulder. His hand clamped down on her arm with more force than necessary, fingers digging into muscle, twisting. The grab was rough enough to be painful, designed to be painful, intended to provoke a reaction that could be labeled resistance. Her shoulder protested as he wrenched her arm backward, old rotator cuff injury flaring with familiar fire. But she did not resist, did not cry out, did not give him the satisfaction of any response that could be characterized as non-compliance. Instead, she went limp. The technique was specific, taught in military detainee handling courses she had helped design. A compliance fall that absorbed momentum rather than fighting it, that prevented injury by denying leverage, that made the aggressor's force work against itself rather than against the body receiving it. Her knees buckled in a controlled collapse. Her weight shifted forward and down. Bassett, expecting resistance that did not come, stumbled slightly as his push met empty air instead of opposition. She landed on one knee, then both, hands behind her back in submission posture that was technically compliant while being obviously forced. The handcuffs clicked shut. Too tight. The metal edges bit into the skin of her wrists, compressing nerves that were already sending distress signals up her arms. Excessive restraint. Another violation to document. Another piece of evidence for the record she was building in her mind. These cuffs are too tight. I'm requesting you loosen them to prevent nerve damage. Bassett leaned close, breath hot against her ear. Should have thought about that before you started resisting. I have not resisted. Your body cam will confirm that. The silence that followed her statement was notable. Bassett's hand moved unconsciously to the camera mounted on his chest. The gesture was quick, almost invisible, the kind of adjustment that might mean nothing or might mean everything. She was pulled to her feet with the same excessive force that had put her on her knees, marched toward the patrol car with hands cuffed behind her, wrists already tingling with the early signs of circulation restriction. The teenager was still recording. Marlene was still watching. And somewhere in the convenience store, she knew, there were security cameras that captured none of this because they were pointed at the register rather than the pumps. Hargrove opened the rear door of his patrol car. The interior smelled like stale coffee and old sweat, vinyl seats cracked from years of use. She was pushed inside, her head guided under the doorframe with perfunctory care, her cuffed hands pressing against her spine. The door slammed shut. Through the window she could see the deputies conferring. Could see Kincaid approaching her vehicle with evident intent to search. Could see Marlene finally putting her phone away, satisfaction evident in her posture, her civic duty apparently complete. Vivian closed her eyes, took 3 slow breaths, centered herself the way she had learned to center herself in situations far more dangerous than this, in rooms where the wrong word could end negotiations and cost lives, in vehicles traveling through hostile territory where explosions were possible at any moment. What these deputies did not know, what they could not imagine, what would eventually reshape every assumption they had made about this encounter, was that the phone still in her pocket had done more than record. When she pressed those 3 buttons, she had activated an emergency beacon. A beacon linked to a secure network monitored around the clock by people whose job it was to know exactly where she was at all times. A beacon that had pinged her location to 3 phones carried by men who were, at this moment, 12 miles away in a convoy heading toward Fort Stewart. Those phones had buzzed simultaneously with the same alert. Beacon active. V. Cole. GPS coordinates attached. Vivian opened her eyes, watched through the patrol car window as Kincaid opened the door of her vehicle and began rummaging through the contents. Watched as items were extracted, examined, set aside. Her suitcase, her laptop bag, her Kindle, the small leather case she kept in the center console. Kincaid opened the case, paused. Her expression shifted, confusion and something else flickering across her features. She closed the case and walked toward Hargrove, holding it out for his examination. Hargrove looked at the contents. His expression changed too, not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the lips. He closed the case without comment and handed it back to Kincaid. Bag everything. We'll sort it out at the station. The decision was made. The transport would proceed. And somewhere between this gas station and the sheriff's office, 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans were changing course, their drivers responding to a beacon that told them exactly where to go. The drive to the Jessup County Sheriff's Office took 11 minutes. Vivian tracked it by the dashboard clock visible through the cage separating front from back, marking each minute as it passed, keeping her mind occupied with the kind of detail work that prevented spiral thinking. 1458, 1500, 1502. The vinyl seat was designed for discomfort, hard plastic beneath a thin layer of cracked covering. Her cuffed hands pressed against the small of her back, shoulders straining in their sockets. The position was physically difficult, but not unbearable. She had endured worse in training, had endured worse in situations where capture was real rather than theatrical, where the people holding her did not answer to any court. Hargrove drove in silence, occasionally checking his mirror to examine her through the cage. She met his gaze each time, refusing to look away, refusing to display the submission he clearly expected. His lips tightened. His eyes returned to the road. The sheriff's station was a low, concrete building that looked like it had been constructed in the 70s and never updated. Brown brick, narrow windows, a flagpole out front flying Georgia state colors beneath the American flag. The parking lot held 6 patrol cars, 2 civilian vehicles, and a news van from a Savannah television station that had apparently heard something worth investigating. Hargrove parked in the rear lot, away from the news van. The rear door opened. Hot air flooded in, replacing the artificial cool of the car's air conditioning. Vivian was extracted with the same rough efficiency that had defined the entire encounter, pulled to her feet, marched toward a back entrance that kept her out of view of any cameras. The interior of the station smelled like old paper, burned coffee, and the particular staleness of buildings where the air conditioning struggled against Georgia humidity. She was walked past a bullpen of desks, past officers who paused their conversations to watch her passage, past a water cooler and a bulletin board covered with wanted posters and safety reminders. The booking area was small, functional, and presided over by a civilian clerk who looked up from her computer with an expression of weary indifference. She had seen this before. Black woman in cuffs. Story that would not match what the paperwork said. System that would process the arrest regardless. Name? Vivian Cole. Date of birth? March 14, 1972. Address? She gave her Atlanta address, the one on her license, the one that would check out when they ran it through whatever databases they used. The clerk typed without looking at her, fingers moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of arrestees and long since stopped seeing them as individuals. The charge sheet was printed. Disorderly conduct, obstruction of a peace officer, failure to comply with a lawful order. 3 misdemeanors, none of which reflected anything that had actually occurred. The system was creating a narrative, building a case file that would justify the arrest retroactively, transforming a woman who had refused to consent to an illegal search into a criminal whose existence in the wrong place at the wrong time was sufficient cause for detention. Fingerprints were taken. Photographs were taken. The mugshot process was deliberately humiliating, designed to strip dignity along with freedom. She stood where directed, looked where directed, held the placard with the booking number as cameras flashed. Through it all, she maintained composure, did not argue, did not explain, did not attempt to convince anyone of anything. The time for convincing would come later, in rooms with different rules, before audiences who were not already committed to a particular version of events. After booking, she was escorted to a holding cell at the end of a corridor. Small, clean enough, furnished with a metal bench and a toilet with no privacy screen. The door closed behind her with the particular finality of incarceration, metal on metal, echoes fading into silence. She sat on the bench, positioned herself where she could see both the door and the small window set high in the wall. Waited. Her phone had been confiscated during booking, along with her wallet, her watch, her wedding ring. Standard procedure. Also an effective way to cut off communication, to prevent documentation, to ensure that whatever happened next would occur without external witness. But the beacon had already done its work. The signal had been sent, the location had been received, and the people who monitored that network were not the kind of people who received alerts about her and did nothing. She estimated time by counting heartbeats, a technique learned during survival training and refined during actual survival situations. 60 beats per minute at rest, 70 when stressed. The math was imprecise but sufficient. 15 minutes passed. 20. 30. At approximately 35 minutes, footsteps approached the holding cell. Not the casual pace of a guard making rounds, something more deliberate. Multiple people moving with coordination. The door opened. Sheriff Wade Emmerich stood in the doorway, a man she had not yet seen but recognized from the photographs in the station's lobby. Late 50s, thick through the middle, wearing a uniform that strained at the buttons. His face was flushed, not with exertion, but with something else. Anger, perhaps, or the first stirrings of fear. "Ms. Cole." His voice was controlled, carefully neutral. "We need to talk about what's happening outside." She did not respond, just waited for him to explain. "There are 3 vehicles in my parking lot, black SUVs, government plates, men who won't identify themselves or state their business." He paused, watching her face for reaction. "They're asking for you." This is where everything changes. If you want to see what happens when decades of assumptions collide with reality, make sure you're subscribed. Vivian rose from the bench slowly, her movements deliberate. The cuffs had been removed during booking, replaced with the implicit restraint of being locked in a cell. She rubbed her wrists where the metal had left red marks, circulation returning with the familiar pins and needles of restored blood flow. "What do you mean, they're asking for me?" Emmerich's expression suggested he was trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not fit. He had arrested thousands of people in his career, had processed hundreds through this very station. Never had any of them triggered a response like this. Never had black SUVs appeared within the hour. "I mean, there are armed federal agents in my parking lot who claim you're under their protection. That's not something that usually happens to disorderly conduct arrestees." He stepped into the cell, close enough that she could see the veins standing out on his forehead, could smell the coffee on his breath. His bulk filled the doorway, blocking escape, not that she had anywhere to go. "So I'm going to ask you once, and I want a straight answer. Who are you, really?" The question hung between them. Vivian considered her options. The reveal was coming regardless. The SUVs in the parking lot had made that inevitable. The only question was how it happened. On whose terms, in what configuration of power? "Take me outside, Sheriff. Let's find out together." It was not an answer, but it was a promise of one. And Emmerich, whatever his flaws, was smart enough to recognize that the situation had moved beyond his control, that the men in his parking lot represented authority that exceeded his own, that the wise move was to find out what he was dealing with before deciding how to proceed. He escorted her personally. Down the corridor, past the bullpen where every officer had found urgent business that required them to watch her passage, through the back door into the parking lot where the August sun was beginning its descent toward evening. 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans sat in formation, blocking the lot's only exit. Their engines idled with the smooth hum of government vehicles well maintained. Tinted windows revealed nothing of the occupants, but the doors were open, and men had emerged, and they were positioned around the vehicles with the disciplined alertness of people prepared for multiple contingencies. She recognized Marcus Webb immediately. He stood at the front of the formation, polo shirt and khakis doing nothing to disguise the military bearing that had been drilled into him over 20 years of service. His face was controlled, professional, but she could read the tension in his jaw, the fury carefully contained behind eyes that had already assessed every threat in the parking lot. "Major General Cole," his voice carried across the asphalt, clear and formal. "Are you injured?" The title landed like a bomb. Vivian saw it hit Emmerich first, the blood draining from his face as the words registered, then Hargrove, who had emerged from the building behind them, then Bassett and Kincaid, who stood near their patrol car with expressions that cycled through confusion, disbelief, and the dawning horror of recognition. Major General? 2 stars. The woman they had handcuffed at a gas station. The woman they had searched without cause. The woman they had arrested on manufactured charges. She was a general. Vivian did not smile. did not allow satisfaction to show on her face. She walked toward Webb with the measured pace of someone reclaiming territory, each step reasserting her authority over the situation that had momentarily stripped it from her. "I'm uninjured, Colonel. Some discomfort from overly tight restraints, but nothing requiring medical attention." Webb's eyes flicked to her wrists, to the red marks still visible on her skin. His jaw tightened further. Behind him, the other members of her security detail shifted almost imperceptibly, anger radiating from men who had spent their careers ensuring her safety and had just learned she had been mistreated while they were 12 miles away. "These officers detained you without cause?" They responded to a 911 call reporting suspicious activity. The activity in question was struggling with a gas pump card reader. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama, letting the absurdity speak for itself. A 2-star general, 31 years of service, handcuffed because a woman at a gas station thought she looked suspicious. Emmerich found his voice. "Now hold on. We had no way of knowing who she was. She wasn't in uniform, didn't identify herself as military." Webb turned to face the sheriff, and the temperature in the parking lot seemed to drop despite the August heat. "Major General Cole is entitled to travel in civilian clothes without being harassed by local law enforcement. Her military status does not require disclosure during a consensual encounter, and nothing about her behavior warranted detention. There was a complaint. We followed procedure. Your procedure included searching her vehicle without consent, arresting her without probable cause, and applying restraints with sufficient force to cause visible injury." Webb's voice was level, controlled, absolutely devastating. "None of that is lawful procedure, Sheriff. That's the kind of conduct that attracts federal attention." The word federal hung in the air. Emmerich understood what it meant. His jurisdiction ended at the county line. Federal oversight could descend with subpoenas and investigations, and the kind of scrutiny that ended careers, that exposed patterns, that brought consequences for behavior that had previously been protected by the insularity of small-town politics. "Now listen here," Emmerich began. "No, Sheriff. You listen." Webb stepped closer, using his height advantage the same way Bassett had used his earlier, except this time the intimidation served justice rather than opposing it. 18 U.S.C., Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law. A federal crime. Your deputies detained a federal official without cause, searched her property without consent, arrested her on charges that will not survive judicial review. That's not a local matter anymore, that's my business." Hargrove had gone pale. Bassett looked like he might be sick. Kincaid had stopped taking notes, her clipboard hanging forgotten at her side. The entire hierarchy of the Jessup County Sheriff's Office stood in their parking lot, watching their authority evaporate in the face of consequences they had never imagined facing. Vivian stepped forward, placing herself between Webb and Emmerich. The mediating position was instinctive, the result of decades spent navigating conflicts between people whose rank exceeded their judgment. "Colonel, let's not escalate further. The damage is done. What matters now is how it's documented and addressed." Webb's expression did not soften, but he stepped back, acknowledging her authority to set the tone. She was the ranking officer. This was her call. And even in a parking lot in rural Georgia surrounded by deputies who had mistreated her, the chain of command held. She turned to face Emmerich, making eye contact with deliberate intent. "Sheriff, my vehicle contains personal property that was searched without my consent. Among that property is a leather case holding military identification and a challenge coin from the Secretary of Defense. Your deputies examined that case and chose to proceed with arrest anyway." The implication was clear. They had seen evidence of who she was, had chosen to ignore it, had decided that a black woman with federal credentials was still somehow more likely to be a criminal than a general. Emmerich's face had gone from pale to gray. "Kincaid looked at that case. She didn't tell me what was in it." "Then I suggest you have a conversation with Deputy Kincaid about what she chose not to share. In the meantime, I want my property returned, my vehicle released, and a full copy of all documentation related to this detention." "You can't just demand—" "I'm not demanding, Sheriff. I'm informing you of what will happen. You can cooperate now and potentially mitigate the consequences. Or you can obstruct, and my next call will be to the Judge Advocate General's office, followed by the Department of Justice. The names landed with weight. JAG, DOJ, federal authorities who could turn a local embarrassment into a career-ending investigation. Emmerich was not stupid. He understood leverage when he saw it, understood that the woman standing before him had access to resources that could make his life very difficult. I'll have your property brought out. He turned and walked back into the station, shoulders hunched, the posture of a man trying to calculate how much damage had already been done and how much could still be contained. Vivian watched him go, then turned back to Webb. I need to make a phone call. Webb produced a secure satellite phone from his pocket and handed it to her without comment. She stepped away from the group, far enough for privacy, and dialed a number from memory. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Mom, your beacon went off. I've been trying to reach you for an hour. I'm fine, Nina. Minor inconvenience. But I need you to do something for me. What happened? Vivian looked back at the deputies clustered near the station entrance, at the sheriff visible through the glass doors, at the tableau of consequences unfolding. I stopped for gas. The sun was setting by the time all the documentation was complete. Vivian's property had been returned, her vehicle released from the evidence hold that should never have been placed on it. Photographs had been taken of her wrists, of the marks left by restraints applied too tight. Statements had been recorded from everyone present, their versions of events preserved for the federal investigation that would inevitably follow. She stood in the parking lot of the quick fuel station, exactly where the encounter had begun 4 hours earlier. The pumps were dark now, the convenience store closed. Marlene Shipley had not reappeared since the SUVs arrived at the sheriff's office. Her gas station would likely become famous soon, for reasons she would not enjoy. Webb approached, his report complete, his duties temporarily suspended. General, we should get you to Fort Stewart. Debrief can happen there, and you'll have access to secure communications. She nodded but did not move immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the spot where she had stood that afternoon, card in hand, trying to buy gas. Such a simple thing, such an ordinary task. And it had nearly cost her everything, not because of anything she had done, but because of what she looked like doing it. 31 years, she said quietly. 31 years in uniform. Deployments to 5 countries, briefings at the Pentagon, testimony before Congress. And I can still be handcuffed at a gas station because someone decided I looked suspicious. Webb did not respond. There was nothing to say. The injustice was self-evident. The pattern was ancient. The progress was incomplete. She knew all of this, had known it her entire career. Still, standing in the place where it had happened, feeling the lingering ache in her wrists, the knowledge felt different, more personal, more raw. The investigation will be thorough, Webb offered. CID is already involved. The Department of Justice will likely open a pattern or practice inquiry. And what will change? The question was not rhetorical. She genuinely wanted to know. What would change really after the investigations concluded and the reports were filed? Would the next black woman at this gas station be treated differently? Would the deputies who had cuffed her face real consequences? Would the system that had enabled their behavior be reformed in any meaningful way? Webb did not answer. He was not in the business of false comfort, and she appreciated that about him. She took a final look at the gas station, committing it to memory. Then she walked to her vehicle, climbed in, and started the engine. The SUVs would escort her to Fort Stewart, and from there she would make the calls that set official machinery in motion. It would take months, maybe years. The wheels of justice turned slowly when they turned at all. But they would turn. She would make sure of it. Not just for herself, but for every black woman who had been stopped at a gas station, searched without cause, cuffed for the crime of talking back. For every person who did not have a security detail, who did not have stars on their shoulders, who did not have the power to hold the system accountable. The car pulled out of the quick fuel lot. The SUVs fell into formation behind her, and the long work of seeking accountability in a system designed to avoid it began. Behind her, in the darkening parking lot, a single security camera pointed at the register captured nothing at all. The pumps stood silent. The evidence of what had happened existed only in body cam footage that might or might not be intact, in witness statements that might or might not be accurate, in the red marks on a woman's wrists that would fade long before justice was served. The night settled over Jessup County, and somewhere in a house with rhinestone reading glasses on the nightstand, Marlene Shipley was learning that the woman she had called 911 about was a two-star general who now had the resources to make her regret that call for a very long time. 3 weeks later, the report landed on desks across multiple agencies with the weight of institutional consequence. Special Agent Tanya Osei had led the investigation, a 15-year veteran of Army Criminal Investigation Division whose reputation for thoroughness had survived multiple attempts by subjects to undermine her findings. Her preliminary report ran 47 pages and included appendices that tripled its length. The executive summary alone was devastating enough to end careers. The evidence section began with the 911 call, transcript reproduced in full. Marlene Shipley's voice, captured in official recording. "There's a black woman at my gas station. She doesn't belong here. Can you send someone?" No allegation of criminal activity, no description of threatening behavior, just presence, just existence, just a woman at a pump, and another woman who decided that presence required police response. The body cam analysis was next. Agent Osei's report noted the 6-minute gap in Deputy Bassett's footage, coinciding precisely with the period during which the decision to detain was made. The gap had been attributed to technical malfunction in preliminary explanations, but forensic examination revealed that the camera had been manually deactivated at 14:49 and reactivated at 14:55. A deliberate interruption, a calculated erasure. The report documented 4 previous incidents in which Bassett's body cam had experienced similar malfunctions, all during encounters that generated citizen complaints, all ruled unfounded by internal review. The pattern was clear. The evidence was systematic. Cell tower data provided additional ammunition. The dispatch log showed Unit 47 responding to the suspicious person call at 14:44, arriving on scene at 14:47. But cellular records told a different story. Bassett and Kincaid's phones had pinged a tower within 400 meters of the quick fuel station at 14:39, 3 minutes before the 911 call was logged. They had been positioned in advance, waiting for a call they somehow knew was coming. The coordination between Marlene Shipley and the responding deputies was not coincidental. It was planned. The implications multiplied from there. How many other arrests had been coordinated in advance? How many other citizens had been targeted not for what they did, but for who they were? How many complaints had been ruled unfounded because the people reviewing them were complicit in the behavior being complained about? Agent Osei's recommendation was unambiguous. Federal civil rights investigation under 18 U.S.C. Part 242, expanded to examine potential pattern or practice violations under 34 U.S.C. Sever 12601. The matter had exceeded the scope of Army CID's jurisdiction. It required Department of Justice involvement. The report was forwarded up the chain of command. Copies were provided to relevant congressional offices. Media inquiries began arriving before the end of the week. Jessup County's relationship with federal oversight was about to change dramatically. The administrative hearing convened 6 weeks after the incident in a conference room at the county courthouse that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee. The hearing officer was Captain Ruth Delaney, brought in from Savannah specifically to avoid conflicts of interest. She had been on the force for 23 years and had developed a reputation for asking questions that other officers preferred not to answer. The hearing was closed to the public but would be transcribed, every word becoming part of a record that would follow the involved officers for the rest of their careers. Vivian attended in uniform for the first time since the incident, her 2 stars visible on her shoulder boards, her presence a reminder of exactly who these deputies had chosen to handcuff. Deputy Bassett took the stand first, his lawyer seated beside him, his union representative watching from the back of the room. His testimony was careful, rehearsed, the product of weeks of preparation by people whose job was to protect him from consequences. Captain Delaney's questions cut through the preparation with surgical precision. Deputy Bassett, explain the 6-minute gap in your body cam footage. Equipment malfunction, ma'am. It happens. Your camera has malfunctioned during 4 separate incidents in the past 2 years, all involving use of force complaints, all ruled unfounded by internal review. She paused, letting the numbers register. Do you find that coincidental? I can't explain equipment issues. That's above my pay grade. The forensic examination indicates your camera was manually deactivated at 14:49 and manually reactivated at 14:55. That's not a malfunction, Deputy. That's a choice. Bassett's lawyer objected. The objection was overruled. The question stood. I don't recall deactivating my camera. You don't recall. During an encounter that you now know involved a 2-star general, you have no memory of what happened during the 6 minutes your camera was off. That's correct. What do you recall from those 6 minutes? Standard procedure. We assessed the situation, made a determination that detention was warranted. Based on what articulable facts? The question was legal terminology, and Bassett knew it. Terry v. Ohio required reasonable articulable suspicion for detention. He needed to cite specific facts that a reasonable officer would find indicative of criminal activity. Standing at a gas pump was not such a fact. The subject was uncooperative. Define uncooperative. She questioned our authority, refused consent to search, got confrontational. Deputy, I've reviewed the portion of your footage that does exist. At no point did Ms. Cole raise her voice, make threatening gestures, or physically resist. She asked questions and exercised constitutional rights. Is that what you consider confrontational? Bassett's jaw tightened. His lawyer whispered something. The silence stretched. She had an attitude. An attitude. Delaney let the word hang in the air, let its inadequacy speak for itself. You detained a federal official, searched her property without consent, applied restraints with sufficient force to cause visible injury, all because she had an attitude. We didn't know she was federal. Her military identification was in plain view during the search. Deputy Kincaid examined it, yet the arrest proceeded anyway. Delaney's voice had not risen, but its impact was unmistakable. Either Deputy Kincaid failed to communicate critical information, or you both knew and chose to proceed regardless. Which is it? The question had no good answer. Both options were damning. Bassett looked to his lawyer, who offered nothing but a slight shake of the head. I'd have to review the footage to answer that. The footage you don't have because your camera was off. Yes, ma'am. The hearing continued for 3 days. Each deputy testified. Sergeant Hargrove testified. Sheriff Emmerich testified. Their accounts conflicted on critical details, contradicted by the evidence that did exist, undermined by the gaps that suggested deliberate concealment. At the end of the 3rd day, Captain Delaney delivered her preliminary findings. Deputies Bassett and Kincaid would be suspended without pay pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Sergeant Hargrove would be reassigned to administrative duties. Sheriff Emmerich would face a formal review by the County Board of Supervisors. No criminal charges, not yet. The federal investigation would determine whether 18 U.S.C. Secretary 242 had been violated. In the meantime, administrative discipline was the only accountability available. Vivian sat through the announcement without visible reaction. She had expected partial measures, had known that systemic change did not happen through single incidents, that officers who violated rights rarely faced the kind of consequences that deterred future violations. The system was designed to protect itself. Breaking that design required sustained pressure over years, not weeks. But it was a start, a foundation, a crack in the wall of impunity that protected officers who confused authority with immunity. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Reporters shouted questions she did not answer. She walked past them without comment, climbed into the SUV where Colonel Webb waited, and allowed herself one moment of exhaustion before the next phase began. "The DOJ is announcing a pattern or practice investigation," Webb informed her. "Press conference tomorrow morning. They want to know if you'll attend." "No, this isn't about me. It's about the 47 complaints before me that went nowhere. It's about the next person who gets stopped at that gas station after I'm gone." "The media will make it about you regardless." "Let them. As long as the investigation proceeds, I don't care what angle the coverage takes." The SUV pulled away from the courthouse, heading toward Fort Stewart, where secure communications and federal coordination awaited. Behind them, Jessup County began the long process of reckoning with decades of behavior that had finally attracted consequences. The reckoning would be incomplete. It always was. Some officers would be disciplined, others protected. Some policies would change, others persist. The structural conditions that enabled the behavior would adapt, find new forms, continue causing harm in ways that would require future investigations to address. But for now, in this moment, accountability had arrived, limited, imperfect, insufficient, and still more than most people in Vivian's position ever received. She watched the Georgia countryside pass by outside the window. Trees and fields and small towns where neighbors still waved according to the signs, where belonging was determined by criteria that had nothing to do with character and everything to do with color, where a woman could stop for gas and find herself in handcuffs because someone decided she looked suspicious. The work was not finished, would never be finished. Justice was not a destination, but a direction, a constant struggle against forces that preferred the convenience of injustice. But she had pushed, had documented, had refused to disappear quietly into a system designed to make her problems go away. And because she had pushed, others would find it slightly easier to push after her. That was the only victory available, the only progress possible. One fight at a time, one refusal at a time, one instance of standing firm when everything demanded submission. The SUV turned onto the highway, heading south toward Fort Stewart. And somewhere in Jessup County, the next chapter was already beginning. If you've made it this far, you understand that justice isn't a single moment. It's a process. A long, slow, frustrating process that requires people who refuse to quit. Subscribe now because this story is far from over, and share it with someone who needs to hear that accountability is possible, even when the system is designed to prevent it. 6 months moved with the grinding slowness of institutional machinery designed to outlast the patience of anyone seeking change. Vivian Cole returned to Fort Hood 3 weeks after the incident, resuming duties that had been briefly suspended while the initial investigation took shape. Her office overlooked a parade ground where soldiers drilled in the Texas heat, their movements precise, their discipline absolute. She watched them sometimes during phone calls that stretched into hours, conversations with attorneys and investigators and congressional staffers who wanted to understand what had happened in Jessup County and what it meant for the broader question of police accountability. The investigation had expanded beyond anything the deputies at that gas station could have imagined when they decided to handcuff a woman for having an attitude. What began as a single incident had become a window into decades of practice, a case study in how small-town law enforcement could operate without oversight, how complaints could be buried, how patterns could persist unchallenged until someone with sufficient resources demanded accountability. Special Agent Tanya Osei had assembled a team of 7 investigators, all of them experienced in civil rights cases, all of them familiar with the particular challenges of proving what everyone knew, but no one could document. They had spent months in Jessup County, interviewing witnesses, subpoenaing records, reconstructing timelines that told stories the official narratives had been designed to obscure. The first comprehensive report arrived on Vivian's desk on a Tuesday morning in February, 6 months and 4 days after she had stood at Pump 4 of the Quick Fuel station, watching her credit card get rejected. The document was thick enough to require a binder, dense with appendices that documented every piece of evidence the investigation had uncovered. She read it alone, in her office, with the door closed and her phone silenced. The reading took 3 hours. When she finished, she sat for a long time looking out the window at the soldiers on the parade ground, thinking about justice and its absence, about systems and their resistance, about the gap between what should happen and what actually did. The report began with the 911 call that had started everything. Transcript reproduced in full, every word preserved for posterity. "There's a black woman at my gas station, the Quick Fuel on Route 17. She's been standing at the pump for almost 10 minutes just staring at the machine. I don't know what she's planning, but something isn't right about her." Agent Osei's analysis was clinical, precise. The caller, Marlene Shipley, had provided no allegation of criminal activity, no description of threatening behavior, no articulable basis for police response. The call documented suspicion based entirely on the subject's race and presence, triggering a response that would not have occurred had the subject been white. The dispatch records followed. Computer-aided dispatch log, case number 2024 JC08847, timestamped with the precision that made institutional lies difficult to maintain. Unit 47, Deputies Bassett and Kincaid, dispatched at 1444. Arrival logged at 1447. 3 minutes response time to a suspicious person call that had not indicated any emergency. But the cell tower data told a different story. Agent Osei had subpoenaed records from the cellular provider, a process that had required federal authorization and taken weeks to complete. The analysis was devastating. Deputy Bassett's personal phone had pinged a tower within 400 meters of the Quick Fuel station at 1439, 5 minutes before the 911 call was even placed. The implication was unavoidable. The deputies had been positioned in advance, had been waiting for a call that had somehow been anticipated. The coordination between Marlene Shipley and the responding officers was not coincidental. It was planned. Vivian turned the page to find the section she had been dreading. The body cam analysis. Deputy Bassett's camera had recorded his approach to the gas station, his initial contact with the subject, the first exchanges of words. The footage was grainy but audible, capturing dialogue that matched the accounts provided in statements. Then, at 1449, the recording stopped. 6 minutes of static. 6 minutes of blackness. 6 minutes during which the decision to detain had been made, the search of her vehicle had been initiated, the handcuffs had been applied. The recording resumed at 1455. By then, Vivian was already in custody, wrists already bearing the marks of restraints applied too tight. The gap had erased precisely the period that mattered most, the period that would have documented the constitutional violations that had occurred. Agent Osei's forensic team had examined the camera itself. Their findings were unambiguous. The device had been manually deactivated at 1449 and manually reactivated at 1455. The technical malfunction, cited in Deputy Bassett's initial report, was a lie. The gap was deliberate, but the report went further. Agent Osei had requested records of every body cam malfunction attributed to Deputy Bassett over the previous 5 years. The pattern that emerged was damning. November 2019, body cam malfunction during traffic stop that resulted in citizen complaint alleging excessive force. Complaint ruled unfounded. March 2021, body cam malfunction during arrest that resulted in citizen complaint alleging racial profiling. Complaint ruled unfounded. August 2022, body cam malfunction during welfare check that resulted in citizen complaint alleging unlawful entry. Complaint ruled unfounded. January 2024, body cam malfunction during domestic disturbance response that resulted in citizen complaint alleging inappropriate use of force. Complaint ruled unfounded. 4 incidents. 4 malfunctions. 4 complaints that could not be substantiated because the evidence that would have substantiated them had been destroyed. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Deputy Bassett had learned that cameras could be turned off, that gaps could be explained away, that the system would accept excuses that served the institution even when those excuses defied logic. Agent Osei's recommendation was explicit. evidence tampering charges under 18 U.S.C. Sector 1599, obstruction of justice, pattern of conduct suggesting deliberate destruction of evidence to avoid accountability. Vivian turned to the next section. The complaint history. The Jessup County Sheriff's Office had received 47 formal complaints between 2019 and 2024. Allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, unlawful detention, civil rights violations. 47 citizens who had believed their grievances deserved investigation, who had trusted the system to hold officers accountable. 43 of those complaints had been ruled unfounded. The remaining 4 had resulted in minimal discipline. Written reprimands, mandatory training, the kind of consequences that left careers intact and behavior unchanged. Agent Osei's team had interviewed 31 of the 47 complainants. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Black and brown residents stopped for minor infractions or no infractions at all. Searches conducted without consent. Force applied without justification. And when they complained, they were dismissed. Their word against the officers. No evidence to support their claims. Case closed. The pattern extended beyond Bassett and Kincaid. Sergeant Hargrove had signed off on 31 of the unfounded rulings, serving as the supervisor who reviewed complaints and determined whether investigation was warranted. His signature appeared again and again, rubber-stamping exoneration of officers whose behavior should have triggered discipline. Sheriff Emmerich had overseen the entire system, had allowed the pattern to persist, had either failed to notice the obvious or chosen not to see it. The report did not speculate on which. It simply documented the facts and let the implications speak for themselves. The final section of the report addressed the search of Vivian's vehicle. Deputy Kincaid had opened the door of the car, had rummaged through its contents, had extracted items for examination. Among those items was a leather case from the center console. The case contained 2 objects: a challenge coin bearing the seal of the Secretary of Defense, awarded for distinguished service during a particularly sensitive operation, and a military identification card, clearly displaying Vivian's name, rank, and photograph. Kincaid had examined the case, had seen the contents, and had said nothing. Agent Osei had interviewed Kincaid about this decision. The interview was reproduced in the appendix, transcript preserved for the record. Deputy Kincaid, you examined a leather case containing military identification for Major General Vivian Cole. Is that correct? I saw some kind of ID, yes. Did you recognize what it was? It looked official. I wasn't sure what agency. The card clearly displays the seal of the Department of Defense. Did you not recognize that seal? I don't have experience with military credentials. You've been a deputy for 9 years. You've never encountered military identification? Not that I recall. Deputy Kincaid, Fort Stewart is 40 minutes from Jessup County. Thousands of military personnel live and work in your jurisdiction. Are you telling this investigation that in 9 years of service, you've never seen a military ID? The transcript noted that Deputy Kincaid had declined to answer further questions on advice of counsel. Vivian closed the report, sat in silence for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her daughter. Nina answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular warmth that came from knowing who was calling before picking up. Mom, I just finished reading it. What do you think? I think Agent Osei did exactly what she was supposed to do. The documentation is thorough. The patterns are undeniable. The recommendations are appropriate. A pause, heavy with the weight of professional assessment giving way to personal frustration. And I think nothing's going to happen. Vivian did not argue. Nina was a JAG attorney, had spent her career navigating the gap between legal standards and practical outcomes. She understood how cases were built and how they fell apart. She understood that evidence and accountability were not the same thing. The DOJ announcement is tomorrow, Vivian said. Pattern or practice investigation. Federal oversight. Which means consent decree negotiations that will take 18 months. Which means monitoring that will last 3 to 5 years. Which means reforms that will be announced and undermined and forgotten before they ever change anything real. You sound cynical. I sound experienced. Nina's voice softened. I'm not saying don't fight. I'm saying know what you're fighting. The system is designed to absorb this kind of pressure and continue functioning. It will make adjustments. It will sacrifice some people. And then it will return to normal because normal is what the system protects. So what do? You keep pushing. You use the platform you have. You make it as expensive as possible for them to return to normal. A long exhale. And you file the civil suit. Vivian had been considering this. A lawsuit against Jessup County, against the sheriff's office, against the deputies individually. Damages for false arrest, civil rights violations, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The case would take years, would cost money she could afford but would rather not spend. Would keep her name in headlines when she would prefer anonymity. I'm not sure I want to be the face of this. You already are, Mom, whether you file or not. The video of Colonel Webb confronting those deputies has 23 million views. Your name is already the story. The question is whether you use that attention or let it fade. The conversation continued for another hour. Nina walked her through the legal options, the likely timeline, the potential outcomes. By the time they hung up, Vivian had not made a decision. But she had a clearer sense of what the decision would cost in either direction. She returned to the report on her desk, read the final page again, the page that contained Agent Osei's summary of findings. Based on the evidence gathered during this investigation, the following conclusions are supported. Deputies Troy Bassett and Nora Kincaid conducted an unlawful detention of a citizen without reasonable articulable suspicion of criminal activity. Deputies Bassett and Kincaid conducted an unlawful search of a citizen's vehicle without consent, probable cause, or warrant. Deputy Bassett deliberately deactivated his body cam to prevent documentation of the encounter. Deputy Kincaid observed evidence suggesting the subject was a federal official and failed to communicate this information to supervisory personnel. The detention and arrest of Major General Vivian Cole constituted deprivation of rights under color of law, a violation of 18 U.S.C. Second 242. The words were precise, the conclusions were damning. And yet Vivian knew that conclusions, however well documented, did not automatically become consequences. The system would have to be pushed, would have to be monitored, would have to be held accountable through sustained pressure that most people did not have the resources to maintain. She had those resources. She had the rank, the connections, the platform. She had a daughter who was a JAG attorney and a security detail that answered to federal authority. She had options that most black women detained at gas stations would never have. The question was whether she was willing to use them. Outside her window, the soldiers continued their drills. Precise movements, absolute discipline. The military was not perfect, but it had standards that were enforced, protocols that were followed, accountability that was real, if imperfect. She had spent 31 years in a system that, for all its flaws, believed in consequences for failure. Jessup County operated by different rules that protected officers who violated rights, rules that dismissed complaints as unfounded, rules that allowed patterns to persist for years without challenge. Those rules were about to change, not because the system wanted them to change, but because someone with sufficient power had finally been affected. Vivian picked up her phone again and dialed the number for the DOJ press office. Chapter. The press conference took place on a Wednesday morning in March, 7 months after Vivian had stopped for gas at a station that would never look at her the same way again. The Department of Justice had chosen the Savannah Federal Courthouse for the announcement, a location that signaled the regional scope of the investigation while avoiding the optics of conducting business in Jessup County itself. The building's marble columns and American flags created a backdrop of institutional authority, a visual statement that federal power was now engaged in matters that local authorities had failed to address. Vivian attended in civilian clothes, seated in the front row alongside Colonel Webb and her daughter Nina. She had declined the invitation to speak, preferring to let the announcement carry its own weight without becoming about her personally. The case was bigger than one incident. The pattern was older than one arrest. Making it about her would distract from the systemic nature of the problems the investigation had uncovered. Assistant Attorney General Marcus Chen took the podium at precisely 10 a.m. His statement had been prepared by lawyers who understood both the legal constraints and the political implications of what was being announced. Every word had been vetted, every phrase calibrated to convey seriousness without over-promising outcomes. Good morning. I'm here today to announce that the Department of Justice is opening a pattern or practice investigation into the Jessup County Sheriff's Office under the authority of 34 U.S.C. Section 12601. The cameras clicked. The reporters leaned forward. This was the moment that would make headlines, the formal declaration that federal attention had arrived. Our investigation will examine whether the Jessup County Sheriff's Office has engaged in a pattern or practice of conduct that deprives individuals of their constitutional rights. Specifically, we will investigate allegations of racial profiling in traffic and pedestrian stops, unlawful searches and seizures, excessive force, and failure to adequately supervise officers or discipline misconduct. Chen paused, letting the weight of the announcement settle. This investigation was prompted by an incident that occurred in August of last year, in which a citizen was detained, searched, and arrested without legal justification. Subsequent investigation by Army Criminal Investigation Division revealed evidence suggesting this incident was not isolated, but rather part of a broader pattern of conduct within the department. He did not name Vivian. The statement referred to her as a citizen, protecting her privacy while using her experience as the catalyst for broader inquiry. She appreciated the framing even as she recognized its limitations. The Department of Justice takes seriously our obligation to ensure that constitutional policing is not a privilege, but a right available to all Americans regardless of race, ethnicity, or background. When local law enforcement fails to meet this standard, federal oversight becomes necessary to protect civil rights and restore public trust. The question period that followed was predictable. Reporters asked about timeline, about resources, about what specific outcomes were expected. Chen answered with the careful vagueness that characterized all such announcements. The investigation would take as long as necessary. Resources were sufficient. Outcomes would depend on findings. One question cut through the diplomatic language. Mr. Chen, can you confirm that the citizen detained in the August incident was Major General Vivian Cole of the United States Army? A pause. Chen glanced toward the front row, where Vivian sat with an expression that gave nothing away. I can confirm that the incident involved a member of the military whose identity has been widely reported in the media. Out of respect for her privacy, I will not discuss her case specifically. What I will say is that her status as a military officer is not what prompted this investigation. What prompted it was evidence of a pattern that extended far beyond any single incident. This investigation is about protecting the constitutional rights of all residents of Jessup County, not about the rank of any particular individual. It was a good answer, accurate without being exploitative. Vivian nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that would not be captured by cameras, but would be understood by those who knew what to look for. The press conference concluded at 10:47. Vivian and Nina slipped out through a side entrance, avoiding the reporters who had gathered outside hoping for interviews. The SUV was waiting, engine running, Webb already inside reviewing briefing materials on a tablet. Well, Nina said as the vehicle pulled away from the courthouse, now we wait. 18 to 24 months, you said. For the investigation, then negotiations for the consent decree, then implementation, then monitoring. Nina's voice carried the weariness of someone who had watched this process play out before. We're looking at 5 years minimum before anything meaningful changes. And that's if everything goes smoothly, which it won't. Vivian watched Savannah slide past the tinted windows. Historic squares with oak trees dripping Spanish moss. Tourists photographing architecture that dated to before the Civil War. A city that understood something about the persistence of history, about how the past shaped the present even when the present preferred to forget. What happens to the deputies in the meantime? Administrative leave continues until the federal investigation concludes. Then the county decides whether to reinstate, discipline, or terminate. Based on the CID report, termination is appropriate. Based on precedent, they'll probably get suspended without pay for a few months and then quietly reassigned. And the sheriff? Up for re-election next year. If the investigation embarrasses him enough, he might face a challenger. If not, he'll probably win and continue as if nothing happened. Nina's assessment was brutal in its realism. This is how it works, Mom. Investigations create pressure. Pressure creates small changes. Small changes are sold as reform. And then the pressure fades and things return to normal. You don't think federal oversight makes a difference? I think it makes a difference for as long as it lasts. I think the moment the monitors leave, the department reverts to form. I think the only lasting change comes from changing who holds power, not from external supervision of how they exercise it. The SUV turned onto the highway, heading toward the airport where a flight to Texas waited. Vivian would return to Fort Hood, to her office and her duties, to the work that had defined her life for 31 years. The investigation would continue without her. The process would grind forward at its own pace. And eventually, perhaps, something would change. Or perhaps not. Perhaps Nina was right. Perhaps systems were designed to absorb pressure and return to equilibrium, to sacrifice individuals without changing patterns, to announce reforms without implementing them. But Vivian had not survived 31 years in uniform by accepting that change was impossible. She had pushed through barriers that were supposed to be permanent, had achieved rank that women who looked like her were not supposed to achieve, had refused to accept limits that were presented as immutable. Jessup County was just another barrier, larger than some, smaller than others, but ultimately subject to the same principle that had governed her entire career. Systems changed when people with power insisted on change and maintained pressure until change occurred. She had power. She would maintain pressure. And eventually, something would give. If you believe that accountability matters, even when it's slow and imperfect, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next part of this story shows exactly what happens when someone refuses to accept the system's definition of normal. The administrative hearing reconvened in April, 8 months after the incident that had started everything. The venue had shifted from the county courthouse to a conference center in Savannah, a neutral location that removed the proceedings from Jessup County's jurisdiction and the implicit pressures that came with conducting business on the defendant's home turf. The change had been requested by the federal monitors already assigned to oversee the process, a small indication that external oversight was beginning to reshape how the county did business. Captain Ruth Delaney presided again, her reputation for thoroughness having earned her assignment to the extended proceedings. She had spent the intervening months reviewing evidence, deposing witnesses, and building a record that would be difficult to challenge regardless of outcome. The hearing room was configured like a courtroom, with witness stand, counsel tables, and gallery seating for observers. Vivian sat in the front row of the gallery, again in uniform, her presence a reminder of the stakes involved. Behind her, representatives from the DOJ Civil Rights Division took notes, their attention signaling that federal interest in the proceedings remained active. Deputy Nora Kincaid took the stand first. She looked different from the woman Vivian remembered from the gas station, thinner, with shadows under her eyes that suggested sleep had become difficult. 9 years on the force, and suddenly her career was in jeopardy because of one afternoon's decisions. The stress was visible in the way she held herself, shoulders hunched, hands clasped tight in her lap. Captain Delaney's questioning was methodical, building the case piece by piece. Deputy Kincaid, during the search of the subject's vehicle, you discovered a leather case in the center console. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. You opened that case and examined its contents. I did. Describe what you found. Kincaid's voice was barely audible. A coin of some kind, and an identification card. A coin of some kind. Delaney repeated the phrase with emphasis that underlined its inadequacy. Deputy Kincaid, you're looking at Exhibit 27. Can you identify it? The challenge coin was displayed on a screen, its details visible to everyone in the room. The seal of the Secretary of Defense, the inscription recognizing distinguished service, the kind of award that was not given casually, that represented recognition at the highest levels of the defense establishment. It appears to be a military coin. Did you recognize it as such when you examined it in the field? A long pause. I thought it might be military. And the identification card, Exhibit 28. Can you read what it says? The military ID appeared on screen. Vivian's photograph. Her name. Her rank, spelled out clearly. Major General. It says Major General Vivian Cole. Did you read those words when you examined the card in the field? I saw them. You saw them. You saw the words Major General on an identification card, and you chose not to report this information to your supervising officer. Is that correct? I wasn't sure what it meant. You weren't sure what Major General meant. I mean, I didn't know if it was real. People have fake IDs. Delaney let the explanation hang in the air, its weakness self-evident. Deputy Kincaid, are you familiar with the process for verifying military credentials? Not really. A phone call to Fort Stewart, 40 minutes away, would have confirmed the identification within minutes. A radio check with your dispatcher could have initiated that process. Did you make either of those inquiries? No, ma'am. Instead, you continued with the arrest of a woman you now knew might be a 2-star general. I didn't know. I just saw the card. Deputy Kincaid, the card explicitly identifies the holder as a Major General. That's a 2-star rank. It's printed clearly on the card you examined. Are you telling this hearing that you were unable to read what was printed on the identification you were holding? Kincaid's counsel objected. The objection was overruled. The question stood. I saw it. I didn't think it was real. Why not? The question hung in the silence. Kincaid looked at her hands, at the table, anywhere except at Captain Delaney or the gallery where Vivian sat watching. She didn't look like a general. The words landed like stones dropped in still water. Ripples of reaction spread through the gallery. Even Kincaid's own counsel winced visibly at the admission. She didn't look like a general, Delaney repeated. Deputy Kincaid, can you describe what a general looks like? I don't know, She was in regular clothes, jeans and a sweatshirt. She didn't look military. What does military look like? No answer. Kincaid sat in silence, unwilling or unable to articulate the assumption that had governed her decision-making. The assumption that a black woman in civilian clothes could not possibly be who her identification said she was. The assumption that women who looked like Vivian did not achieve 2-star rank. The assumption that the eyes could be trusted more than the documents in hand. Delaney pressed forward. Deputy Kincaid, in your 9 years of service, have you ever encountered a white individual with credentials you found difficult to believe? Objection. Kincaid's counsel was on his feet. Relevance. The witness has testified that she disbelieved the subject's credentials because the subject didn't look like a general. I'm exploring whether this skepticism is applied consistently across racial groups or whether it reflects bias in the witness's assessment of credibility. Captain Delaney nodded. Overruled. The witness will answer. Kincaid's face had gone pale. I don't recall any specific instances. So in 9 years of service, you have never questioned the credentials of a white individual based on their appearance, but you questioned Major General Cole's credentials because she didn't look like a general. Is that your testimony? I'm not saying I questioned her because she was black. What are you saying, Deputy Kincaid? Silence. Kincaid's counsel leaned in, whispered something. Kincaid shook her head. I'm saying I made an error in judgment. An error in judgment that resulted in the false arrest of a decorated military officer. An error in judgment that was influenced, whether consciously or not, by assumptions about what a general should look like. An error in judgment that this hearing must determine was made in good faith or represents a pattern of biased enforcement. The rest of Kincaid's testimony continued for 3 hours. She was questioned about training, about previous encounters, about her understanding of constitutional standards for detention and search. Her answers were careful, lawyered, designed to minimize exposure while admitting the minimum necessary to maintain credibility. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, the record was clear. She had seen evidence of who Vivian was and had chosen to proceed anyway. The choice might have been made unconsciously, governed by biases she did not recognize or would not admit. But the choice had been made, and the consequences had followed. Deputy Bassett's testimony the following day was more combative. He entered the hearing room with the posture of a man who believed himself wronged, who viewed the proceedings as persecution rather than accountability. His counsel had advised against this approach, but Bassett had his own ideas about how to handle the situation. Captain Delaney's questioning was direct. Deputy Bassett, your body cam footage shows a 6-minute gap beginning at 14:49. Can you explain this gap? Equipment malfunction. Forensic analysis indicates the camera was manually deactivated at 14:49 and manually reactivated at 14:55. This is inconsistent with equipment malfunction. Bassett shifted in his seat. I don't know what to tell you. The camera stopped working. Deputy Bassett, you're under oath. Are you testifying that you did not manually deactivate your body cam? I'm testifying that I don't recall doing so. 4 previous incidents in which your body cam malfunctioned during encounters that generated citizen complaints. All 4 ruled unfounded because no footage existed to corroborate the complaints. Do you find this pattern concerning? Equipment fails. It happens. Always during complaints against you. Never during routine encounters. Always during the precise moments that would document allegations of misconduct. Bassett's face reddened. Are you accusing me of something? I'm asking you to explain a pattern that appears inconsistent with random equipment failure. I'm not a technician, I don't know why the cameras fail. I know I've never intentionally tampered with evidence. The testimony continued, but the damage was done. Bassett's denials were contradicted by forensic evidence. His explanations were implausible. His demeanor suggested a man more concerned with protecting himself than with acknowledging the truth. Sergeant Dean Hargrove took the stand on the 3rd day. His testimony was more calculating than Bassett's, more aware of the legal stakes involved. He had been advised by counsel with deeper experience in these matters, and he understood that surviving the hearing required navigating between complete denial and damaging admission. Sergeant Hargrove, you arrived on scene approximately 10 minutes after initial contact. What did you observe when you arrived? I observed Deputies Bassett and Kincaid engaged with a subject who appeared uncooperative. Describe uncooperative. She was questioning their authority, demanding legal justifications, making the situation more difficult than it needed to be. Was she being physically aggressive? Not physically, no. Was she making threats? She was using a tone that I found inappropriate. A tone. Delaney let the word sit. Sergeant Hargrove, under what legal standard does an inappropriate tone justify continued detention? Hargrove's counsel objected. Legal conclusion, overruled. In my experience, attitude often indicates that a situation is going to escalate. De-escalation sometimes requires establishing control early. Establishing control by arresting citizens who have committed no crime? By maintaining authority in a situation that was becoming contentious. The contentious was a woman asking why she was being detained and asserting her constitutional rights. Are you testifying that constitutional assertions justify arrest? I'm testifying that my officers made a judgment call based on the totality of circumstances. The totality of circumstances included a woman standing at a gas pump, a complaint from a caller who provided no allegation of criminal activity, and a subject who asked questions you found inconvenient. Is that an accurate summary? Hargrove's jaw tightened. That's a reductive characterization. Then provide a complete one. What specific criminal conduct did you observe or have reasonable suspicion to believe had occurred? Silence. Hargrove looked at his counsel, then back at Delaney. In the moment, I believed there was reasonable suspicion. Reasonable suspicion of what specific crime? Disorderly conduct. Obstruction. Disorderly conduct requires a person to engage in violent, tumultuous, or threatening behavior. Did the subject engage in such behavior? Her tone was "oh." I'm asking about behavior, not tone. No violent behavior. Obstruction requires a person to knowingly resist, delay, or obstruct a public officer in the discharge of their duties. The subject was answering questions and providing identification. In what way did that constitute obstruction? Hargrove did not answer. Sergeant, you authorized the arrest of a citizen on charges that, by your own admission, you cannot now articulate a factual basis for. Is that an accurate summary? I made a judgment call. A judgment call that violated the Fourth Amendment rights of an American citizen who happened to be a two-star general in the United States Army. A judgment call that your deputy's own body cam footage, such as exists, does not support. A judgment call that this hearing is now required to evaluate because your department's internal review mechanisms failed to identify any problem with your conduct. The testimony continued, but the essential point had been made. Hargrove had authorized an arrest without probable cause, had failed to ensure his deputies followed constitutional standards, had presided over a system that dismissed complaints without investigation and protected officers who violated rights. Sheriff Wade Emmerich took the stand on the fourth day. He was the most experienced witness, with 32 years in law enforcement and nearly 2 decades as the elected sheriff of Jessup County. He understood how these proceedings worked, understood the political stakes, understood that his testimony would be scrutinized not just for legal sufficiency, but for the signal it sent to voters who would decide his future. His approach was conciliatory, apologetic, carefully designed to distance himself from the conduct of his subordinates while minimizing his own responsibility for the culture that had produced that conduct. Sheriff Emmerich, you oversee a department of 47 sworn officers. Are you aware of the complaint history documented in the federal investigation? I am now aware. Yes. You are now aware. Prior to the federal investigation, were you aware that 43 of 47 complaints against your officers had been ruled unfounded? I receive summary reports. I don't review individual cases unless they're escalated. In 5 years, none of these complaints were escalated to your attention? Sergeant Hargrove handled complaint review. I trusted his judgment. You trusted his judgment. Sergeant Hargrove signed off on 31 of the 43 unfounded rulings. Did you review his methodology for determining whether complaints had merit? I relied on his expertise. His expertise resulted in a 91% unfounded rate. National averages for similar departments range from 40 to 60%. Did this discrepancy raise any concerns? I wasn't aware of the comparison. You're the chief law enforcement officer of Jessup County. You weren't aware of how your complaint handling compared to national standards? Emmerich's discomfort was visible. I have many responsibilities. I can't monitor every metric. Can you monitor constitutional compliance? I trust my officers to follow their training. Their training resulted in the false arrest of a decorated military officer. Their training resulted in a pattern that the Department of Justice has now characterized as systematic deprivation of civil rights. Their training, Sheriff, has failed. The hearing concluded with closing statements from counsel and a promise that findings would be issued within 30 days. Vivian watched the proceedings end with the same composure she had maintained throughout, giving nothing away, allowing the process to speak for itself. The findings, when they came, were a partial victory. Deputies Bassett and Kincaid were terminated, effective immediately. The evidence of deliberate body cam deactivation and failure to report relevant information was sufficient to overcome the substantial procedural protections that made firing officers difficult. Sergeant Hargrove was demoted to deputy and suspended without pay for 6 months. His role in the complaint review process was characterized as inadequate supervision rather than deliberate wrongdoing, a distinction that preserved his career while acknowledging his failures. Sheriff Emmerich received a formal censure from the County Board of Supervisors, but retained his position. The board determined that he bore institutional responsibility for the department's failures, but had not personally engaged in misconduct. He would face voters in the fall election, where his record would be debated and ultimately judged. The outcomes were, as Nina had predicted, imperfect. Some accountability, but not enough. Some consequences, but not commensurate with the violations. A system that had been pressured into change, but had not been fundamentally transformed. Vivian received the news at Fort Hood, reading the findings report in the same office where she had read the investigation report months earlier. The parade ground outside was quiet now, soldiers having completed their drills for the day. She called Nina. "I heard," Nina said before Vivian could speak. "2 terminations, 1 demotion, 1 censure. Better than average, honestly." "Better than average?" "Mom, the average outcome in cases like this is nobody gets fired, and the department issues a statement about commitment to improvement. 2 terminations is actually significant." "It's not enough. It's never enough. That's the nature of systemic injustice. There's no outcome that makes what happened okay. There's only outcomes that make it slightly less likely to happen again." Vivian was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the Texas sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "I've decided to file the civil suit." "Good. I'll start the paperwork tomorrow." "It's not about the money." "I know. It's about the record. It's about making the pattern undeniable in a forum where the evidence can't be buried. It's about the next woman at that gas station." Nina's voice softened. "I know, Mom. I know exactly what it's about." The civil suit was filed in federal district court 2 weeks later. Vivian Cole, individually, versus Jessup County, Georgia, the Jessup County Sheriff's Office; Troy Bassett, individually and in his official capacity; Nora Kincaid, individually and in her official capacity; Dean Hargrove, individually and in his official capacity; Wade Emmerich, individually and in his official capacity. The complaint alleged violations of the 4th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. It sought compensatory damages for the false arrest, punitive damages to deter future violations, and injunctive relief requiring the implementation of specific reforms. The county's response was immediate and predictable: a motion to dismiss on qualified immunity grounds, arguing that the individual defendants had not violated clearly established law. The motion cited precedent suggesting that officers were entitled to reasonable mistakes about the scope of their authority, that uncertainty about legal standards protected them from personal liability. The motion was denied. The court found that the right to be free from detention without reasonable articulable suspicion was clearly established, that the right to refuse consent to search was clearly established, that the right to record police encounters was clearly established. Whatever uncertainty might exist about other aspects of police authority, there was no uncertainty about the basic constitutional principles the defendants had violated. The case proceeded to discovery. For 6 months, documents flowed between parties. Deposition transcripts accumulated. Expert witnesses were retained to testify about use of force standards, about reasonable suspicion requirements, about the prevalence of racial bias in policing and its documented effects on detention decisions. The county's defense was straightforward. The officers had made reasonable mistakes in a confusing situation, had acted in good faith based on information available to them, had not intentionally violated anyone's rights. The arrest had been wrong, they admitted, but wrongness was not unconstitutional if it was not intentional. Vivian's legal team responded with the evidence that made intention irrelevant: the body cam gap, the cell tower data, the pattern of unfounded complaints, the examination of military identification followed by continued arrest. Piece by piece, they built a case that the conduct was not mistaken, but deliberate, not confused, but calculated, not accidental, but reflective of a culture that viewed certain citizens as inherently suspicious. The settlement offer came in December, 14 months after the original incident. The county proposed $1.2 million, payment divided between compensatory and punitive components, no admission of wrongdoing, a confidentiality agreement that would seal the terms and prohibit public discussion of the case. Vivian rejected it without hesitation. "The confidentiality clause defeats the purpose," she told Nina during a phone call that stretched past midnight. The whole point is creating a record that other people can use. If we seal everything, we've accomplished nothing except personal compensation. I told them you'd say that. They're prepared to negotiate on the confidentiality, but they want to settle before trial. Because trial creates public testimony. Because trial means the evidence becomes permanently part of the record. Because trial means they can't control the narrative. Exactly. Then we go to trial. The case was scheduled for March, 18 months after the incident. Federal Courthouse in Savannah, same building where the DOJ had announced its investigation. The symmetry was not lost on anyone involved. Jury selection took 3 days. 12 citizens of the Southern District of Georgia, selected through careful questioning to identify biases that might affect their ability to evaluate the evidence fairly. The final panel included 7 white jurors, 3 black jurors, 1 Latino juror, and 1 Asian American juror. A cross-section of the region, as close to representative as the process could produce. Opening statements framed the case in competing narratives. The plaintiff's counsel, a civil rights attorney named Patricia Washington, who had tried 24 similar cases, spoke first. Her statement was simple, direct, grounded in the documented facts. This case is about what happened when a woman stopped for gas at a station in Jessup County, Georgia. She was detained without cause, searched without consent, arrested without probable cause, and handcuffed with force sufficient to leave marks on her wrists that persisted for days. The evidence will show that every element of this encounter violated the Constitution that these officers swore to uphold. The defense counsel, a county attorney named James Morrison, who had defended police misconduct cases for 15 years, offered an alternative framing. This case is about officers who responded to a suspicious person call and made judgment calls in a confusing situation. They didn't know who Ms. Cole was. They didn't have the benefit of hindsight that we have now. They acted based on the information available to them, and when it became clear that the situation was not what they thought, they released her immediately. This was a mistake, not a constitutional violation. The trial lasted 11 days. Witnesses testified. Evidence was presented. The body cam footage, such as existed, was played for the jury. The gap was marked, its absence noted, its implications debated. Expert witnesses explained the standards for reasonable suspicion, for probable cause, for constitutional policing. The 47 complaints were introduced, their pattern documented, their unfounded rulings questioned. Vivian testified on the 7th day. She wore civilian clothes, having been advised that her uniform might prejudice the jury in ways that cut both directions. Some jurors might be influenced by her rank. Others might resent it. Better to present as what she had been that day, a citizen, traveling alone, stopping for gas at a station that should have been unremarkable. Patricia Washington walked her through the encounter minute by minute. The credit card rejection, the 911 call she had not heard until later, the approach of the deputies, the demands for identification, the questions about her occupation, the escalation to search and arrest. Ms. Cole, at any point during this encounter, did you physically resist the deputies? No. Did you make any threatening statements? No. Did you refuse to provide identification? No. I provided my driver's license when requested. What did you do that prompted the arrest? I asked questions. I declined to consent to a search of my vehicle. I asserted my constitutional rights. And for that you were handcuffed? Yes. Were the handcuffs applied with appropriate force? Vivian paused, remembering the bite of metal into flesh, the compression of nerves, the marks that had taken days to fade. They were applied too tightly. I requested they be loosened to prevent nerve damage. That request was denied. Do you have documentation of the injuries? Photographs were displayed. Vivian's wrists, photographed within hours of the incident, showing the red marks left by restraints. Medical records documenting the compression injuries, the treatment recommended, the timeline for healing. Ms. Cole, you served 31 years in the United States Army. You achieved the rank of Major General. You have been deployed to combat zones, have briefed presidents, have led thousands of soldiers. In all that experience, have you ever been treated the way you were treated at that gas station? I have been treated worse by enemies of this country. I have never been treated this way by its law enforcement. The cross-examination attempted to undermine her credibility, to suggest that her demeanor had contributed to the escalation, that her questions had been confrontational, that her refusal to consent to search had been suspicious in itself. Vivian answered each question with the same composure she had shown throughout, refusing to be rattled, refusing to provide the emotional reaction that might be used against her. The defense called its witnesses. The deputies testified, their versions of events now polished by months of legal preparation. They had been doing their jobs. They had followed their training. They had made reasonable decisions based on the information available. But the evidence contradicted them. The body cam gap, the cell tower data, the examination of military identification followed by continued arrest, the pattern of complaints dismissed without investigation. Closing arguments came on the 11th day. Patricia Washington spoke for 90 minutes, walking the jury through every piece of evidence, every contradiction, every failure. She ended with the simplest possible statement of what the case was about. This woman stopped for gas. That's all. She stopped for gas, and because someone thought she looked suspicious, she was detained, searched, and arrested. She was handcuffed so tightly that it left marks on her wrists. She was put in the back of a patrol car and taken to a jail where she was booked on charges that had no basis in law. All of this happened because of what she looked like, not what she did. James Morrison responded with an appeal to the difficulty of policing, to the split-second decisions officers must make, to the deference that courts have traditionally shown to law enforcement. These officers were doing their jobs. They received a call about suspicious activity. They investigated. They made decisions that, with the benefit of hindsight, we now know were wrong. But wrong is not unconstitutional. Mistake is not malice, and the Constitution does not require perfection from our police officers. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. When they returned, the foreperson, a retired teacher from Savannah, read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts." The damages were substantial. $300,000 in compensatory damages for the false arrest and its effects, $750,000 in punitive damages against the individual defendants, apportioned according to their respective roles. Injunctive relief requiring the implementation of specific reforms, including body cam auditing, de-escalation training, and civilian oversight of complaint investigations. The total award was over $1 million. But the money was not the victory. The victory was the record. The verdict entered into the permanent records of the federal court, establishing that what had happened at that gas station was not a mistake, but a violation. A violation of constitutional rights. A violation that would now be cited in future cases, used as precedent, deployed in the ongoing struggle to hold police accountable for misconduct. Vivian sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read, her expression unchanged. She had known, going in, that the outcome was uncertain. Juries were unpredictable. Civil rights cases against police were difficult to win. The deck was stacked in ways that made accountability the exception rather than the rule. But this time, accountability had prevailed. Imperfectly, incompletely, but prevailed. This is what accountability looks like when someone refuses to accept the system's definition of justice. Share this story with someone who needs to know that fighting back can make a difference. The consent decree was signed 4 months after the verdict. The Department of Justice and Jessup County reached agreement on a framework for reform that would be overseen by a federal monitor for the next 5 years. The decree required body cam auditing protocols that would flag suspicious gaps for automatic review, required de-escalation training for all officers, with annual certification, required civilian oversight of complaint investigations, with authority to demand additional inquiry when findings seemed inadequate. It was not everything the DOJ had sought. The county had negotiated hard, pushing back on provisions that it argued were too costly or too intrusive. The final agreement was a compromise, like all consent decrees, achieving some objectives while deferring others. But it was change, real change, enforceable by federal court order, monitored by people who answered to authorities beyond Jessup County's control. The kind of change that might not have happened at all if a woman had not stopped for gas at the wrong station at the wrong time and then refused to disappear quietly into the system. Sheriff Wade Emmerich lost his re-election bid the following November. His opponent, a former Georgia Bureau of Investigation agent named Marcus Webb, no relation to Vivian's aide-de-camp, ran on a platform of reform and accountability. He won by 11 points, the largest margin in a Jessup County sheriff's race in 40 years. Troy Bassett and Nora Kincaid never worked in law enforcement again. Their terminations were upheld on appeal, and their names appeared on a state registry of officers separated for cause, making it effectively impossible for them to be hired by other departments. They had become examples. Their careers ended as warning to others about the consequences of violating rights. Dean Hargrove served his suspension and returned to patrol duty, having been demoted to the rank he had held a decade earlier. He transferred to a different county within a year, seeking distance from the case that had derailed his career. Whether he learned anything from the experience was a question only time would answer. Marlene Shipley sold the Quick Fuel station 6 months after the verdict. The new owners changed the name, repainted the exterior, installed new pumps with card readers that actually worked. The gas station that had become infamous would eventually be forgotten, its history buried under fresh coats of paint and the endless turnover of commercial properties. Vivian Cole returned to Fort Hood and continued her service. She did not speak publicly about the case, did not write memoirs or give interviews, did not become the symbol that some wanted her to become. She had achieved what she set out to achieve, a record, a precedent, a small increment of accountability in a system designed to resist it. But the story did not end there. Stories like this never really end. They continue in consequences that unfold over years, in changes that accumulate slowly, in the next encounter between a black citizen and a police officer that goes slightly differently because someone, somewhere, remembered what happened in Jessup County. 3 months after the consent decree was signed, Vivian sat in her office at Fort Hood, working through the paperwork that constituted the unglamorous reality of two-star command. The sun had set an hour ago, but she often worked late, preferring the quiet of evening to the bustle of daytime operations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nina. "Check the news. DOJ just announced first progress report on Jessup County. Complaint processing times down 40%. Body cam compliance at 97%. They're actually doing it." Vivian allowed herself a small smile. Progress. Actual, measurable progress. Not transformation, not redemption, but progress. The kind of incremental improvement that accumulated over time into something that might eventually deserve to be called change. She typed a reply. "Good, but watch the implementation. Numbers can be gamed." Nina's response came quickly. "Already on it. I've got sources inside the department. The numbers are real, for now." For now. The caveat that haunted every reform effort. Progress was real until it wasn't. Change was permanent until it reversed. Systems reformed until the pressure faded and old patterns reasserted themselves. But for now, in this moment, something had changed. Not enough. Never enough. But something. Vivian returned to her paperwork, to the reports and briefings and decisions that constituted her daily work. The case was closed, as much as cases like this ever closed. The verdict was rendered. The decree was signed. The headlines had moved on to other outrages and other struggles. Life continued. But not exactly as before. Because somewhere in Jessup County, a black woman was stopped at a traffic light, and the officer who approached her vehicle was wearing a body cam that could not be turned off without triggering automatic review. And somewhere in the evidence room, complaint files were being processed according to protocols that required investigation rather than dismissal. And somewhere in the training facility, Deputies were learning about constitutional standards in ways that previous training had never emphasized. Small changes, incremental changes, the kind of changes that might not seem like much in isolation but accumulated over time into something larger. That was the work. That was what it meant to fight a system designed to resist change. You pushed and the system pushed back, and sometimes you made a little progress, and then you pushed again. Over and over, year after year, generation after generation. Not because you believed you would ever finally win, but because the alternative was surrender, and surrender was not something Vivian Cole knew how to do. She finished her paperwork around 9 p.m. and prepared to head home. The drive from the base to her quarters took 15 minutes, through Texas, darkness lit by street lamps and starlight. As she gathered her things, her phone buzzed again. Not Nina this time. An unknown number, the kind that usually meant spam but occasionally meant something else. She answered cautiously. Cole. A pause. Static on the line, the kind that suggested distance or interference. General Cole. The voice was female, unfamiliar, with an accent Vivian could not quite place. I have information about your case that you should see. Who is this? Someone who was there, someone who saw things that weren't in the reports. Vivian's grip tightened on the phone. What things? The 911 call wasn't the first call that day. There was another one, 30 minutes earlier. A call that got routed differently, to different people. I don't understand. The woman who called the police on you? She was told to. Someone called her, described your vehicle, told her to watch for you. The whole thing was set up. Vivian's mind raced. Set up. The cell tower data showing deputies in position before the 911 call. The too-quick response to a routine suspicious person call. The coordination that had seemed suspicious but had never been fully explained. Who set it up? Why? The line crackled, static increasing, as if the connection was failing. I can't talk long, but you should know, this wasn't random. You weren't a random target. Someone knew you would be there. Someone wanted this to happen. Why? Why would anyone want this? That's what you need to find out. Check the sheriff's email from the day after the incident. There's a message that was partially redacted in the federal records request. Get the unredacted version. You'll see. The line went dead. Vivian stood in her office, phone still pressed to her ear, processing what she had just heard. Not random. Set up. Someone wanted this to happen. She lowered the phone and pulled up the federal records from the case. Searched through the documents until she found what the caller had described. Sheriff Emmerich's email from August 15th, the day after her detention. Most of it was routine administrative communication, but one message stood out. Subject, Incident at Quick Fuel. We need to discuss containment. Individual status complicates matters. Recommend redacted before this goes further. The recipient field was redacted. The recommendation was redacted. The context was unclear, but the implications were troubling. Containment. Complicates matters. This was not the language of routine police administration. This was the language of crisis management, of cover-up, of something that extended beyond a simple false arrest. Vivian forwarded the email to Nina with a single line of text. Can you get the unredacted version? Then she sat down and began to think. 2 weeks later, a manila envelope arrived at her office with no return address. The postmark was Jessup County, Georgia. Inside, there was a single photograph. Vivian at the gas station, standing at pump 4, credit card in hand. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the street, through a telephoto lens. The timestamp in the corner showed 14:31, 8 minutes before the 911 call was placed. 16 minutes before the deputies arrived. Someone had been watching her before the call, photographing her, documenting her presence. Handwritten on the back of the photograph in neat block letters. We see you. We always see you. Vivian stared at the words for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called Agent Osei. I need to report a possible threat, and I need to reopen the investigation. The case, it seemed, was not as closed as she had thought. The sun set over Fort Hood as Vivian filed her report, adding the photograph and the anonymous phone call to the record. The evidence pointed in directions she did not yet understand, toward questions she did not yet know how to ask. Someone had known she would be at that gas station. Someone had arranged for her detention, and that someone was still out there, still watching, still interested in whatever had motivated the original setup. The work continued. The fight continued. The struggle for accountability in a system designed to avoid it continued. Outside her window, the Texas night spread toward horizons she could not see. The same stars that had watched over her at the gas station in Georgia shone down on the base where she commanded thousands of soldiers. The same country that had produced the deputies who handcuffed her also produced the institutions that had held them accountable. Both things were true. The injustice and the response to injustice. The violation and the vindication. The harm and the healing. Vivian Cole had spent 31 years navigating that contradiction, serving a country that did not always treat its citizens fairly, believing in ideals that the reality often failed to match. She would continue navigating it for as long as she was able, for as long as the fight required. The gas station was still there, under new ownership now, its pumps humming their mechanical song for customers who knew nothing of what had happened there. The deputies were gone, their careers ended, their names becoming footnotes in the longer story of civil rights enforcement. The system had absorbed the pressure and adjusted, had made changes that might or might not last, had demonstrated that accountability was possible, while also demonstrating how difficult that accountability remained to achieve. And somewhere, someone was watching, still watching, planning something that Vivian did not yet understand, but would eventually have to confront. The envelope sat on her desk, the photograph face up, the message visible. "We see you. We always see you." She slid the photograph into her classified files, secured the drawer, and turned off her desk lamp. The fight was not over. It was never over. But for tonight, she had done what she could, filed what needed to be filed, reported what needed to be reported, set in motion the machinery that would eventually produce answers, or at least more questions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new moments where principle would clash with convenience, and she would have to choose who she wanted to be. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she would rest, would recover, would prepare for whatever came next. The darkness gathered outside her window. The stars continued their ancient watch, and Vivian Cole, Major General, United States Army, survivor of one confrontation, and now aware that another was coming, closed her office door and walked out into the Texas night, heading home through streets that felt both familiar and newly uncertain. Behind her, in the locked drawer of her desk, the photograph waited. Evidence of something she did not yet understand. Promise of a story that was not yet finished. The gas station in Jessup County was closed for the night. The new owners had installed better lighting, better cameras, better systems for ensuring that what had happened would not happen again. Progress, measured in security upgrades and policy changes. Progress that might or might not last. But the questions remained. Why had she been targeted? Who had arranged it? What had motivated a setup that seemed too elaborate for random harassment, too coordinated for simple bias? Those questions would have to wait for answers that did not yet exist, for investigations that had not yet begun, for truths that were still buried under layers of redaction and denial. For now, there was only the night, and the drive home, and the knowledge that somewhere, someone was watching. The system had bent. It had not broken. And the people who had wanted her silenced were still out there, still operational, still pursuing whatever agenda had prompted them to target a 2-star general at a gas station in rural Georgia. The fight continued. The story continued. The long, slow work of accountability in a system that preferred impunity continued. And Vivian Cole, who had faced worse odds in worse places, prepared to continue with it. One day at a time, one decision at a time, one refusal to surrender at a time. Until the truth, whatever it was, finally came to light.
durch des Himmels prächtigen Land laufet, Brüder eure, von laufet, Brüder eure, von freudig, wie ein Held zum Siegen, wie ein Held zum Siegen, laufet, Brüder eure,
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.